Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to show you how to install floating shelves using Hovr Solutions brackets. The first step of this process is building a jig to hold your workpiece into place. Unless you have woodworking clamps, this is a simple alternative at a low cost. This jig is composed of 3 pieces of 2x4. So start by screwing the first one on the workbench, then attach the 2 others with pocket holes like so. I also added 2 small pieces of plywood on each end to act as stop blocks. If you do this right, your workpiece should fit nice and snug, making it easy to work on top of the piece without having it moving around. Once you're done building the jig to hold your workpiece into place, you'll need to get a 3/4 inch straight bit that you'll use to route your channel. The female bracket measures 1.5 inches, and in this case the shelf is 2 inches. So that means that I'll need to adjust my router jig to be 1/4 inch away from the blade. If I adjust it properly, the edge of the blade should be right in the middle of the shelf. That way I'll simply route my first channel, flip it over, and do the same on the other side. Make sure to measure twice to have the perfect fit every time. So here's what the router jig should look like. I was lucky enough to have an edge guide come with my OF 1400 Festool router. So I simply needed to add a scrap piece of plywood to create a perfect 2-inch spacing. Remember to measure the spacing between the edge of your blade and your jig to make sure it ends up straight in the middle of the shelf. If you don't, either the bracket won't fit or your edges will end up too thin, which will affect the strength of the installation. This jig was really simple to make. I secured the first piece on the router base, then I screwed the other piece on the first one, and voila! This whole process really wouldn't be possible without a plunge router. It is so important for this install that you calculate the perfect depth. The best way to be consistent is to use the depth setting on the router. I recommend using a scrap piece of wood to make sure that the depth adjustment is perfectly accurate, because you need to be 0.9 inches deep. The reasons for that is that one side of the bracket needs to stick out 1/64 of an inch and the other side needs to be recessed 1/64 of an inch for the perfect installation. The saying practice makes perfect definitely applies in this case. In this step, you will trace the outline of the bracket to make sure it is nice and centered. You don't need to do this, but in my opinion, it is nice to have an outline to be able to see if anything moves out of place during the routing process. Always make sure that you have at least 1/4 inch of material left around your bracket, or else it won't be as strong. If you have enough space, I would recommend overstepping the lines on each far end so that you have a little bit of extra space to fit in the bracket. So here's what the jig should look like. You should be able to move pretty freely, but you still want it to be a little tight so that it holds up without any assistance. Once you've measured and set the perfect depth on the router, you'll also want to double check the spacing between the blade and the guard. After that, you'll be all set to start routing the channel. I would recommend making your channel in multiple passes. It will allow you to have more control over your tool and avoid kickbacks or other issues. Having a dust collector definitely makes this process much easier. I personally use the CT36 from Festool. It will save you some time, plus it's so much easier to see what you're doing when you don't have a bunch of wood chips constantly flying in your face. As you can see, I overstepped my line a little bit and I'm perfectly in the middle, so it's time to do the second channel. Just look at this perfect fit. One side is recessed 164 and the other is sticking out 164. The channel is nicely cleaned up. It's time to screw in your bracket. Now that the bracket is screwed in the channel, you will need to make holes where the set screws are going to go. You will need to install at least 2 of them and make sure that they are at least 2 inches inside the shelf and half an inch away from the edge. The next step is making the threads so that you can secure the set screws into place with the provided Allen key. To install the male component, start by placing it in the desired location. Then use a level to make sure that the shelf isn't going to be at an angle. After that, trace a line under the bracket for future reference and also mark the location of your studs. You can find your studs very easily with a simple stud finder. You will also want to mark the stud locations on your bracket to pierce it in the right location. The die lines on the bracket is there to indicate where to drill to be properly centered. Even if I trace the line, I like to use the level again after putting in the first screw to make sure that I'm perfectly leveled. When you install the shelf, you'll need to be at a 15-degree angle and then give it a little tap to set it into place. Once you're done, simply add the set screws using the Allen key. To conclude this video, I'd like to say that before I used Hovr, I've always thought that floating shelves were flimsy, unreliable, and more for decoration. But this system is completely different. It's super easy to install, it's extremely strong, and it looks amazing on your wall. So I really can't recommend this enough to you. And if you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it.